This is basically a kleptocracy where money from the state is funneled to the friends or the cronies of Viktor Orbán.
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. I'm your host, Emily Chatinier, recording from Brussels, and as usual, I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter and my co-host Alexander Fanta in Vienna. Hi, Alex.
Hi, good morning.
In this episode, we're looking at how Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has turned his country into one of European Union's biggest headaches. From clashes over Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine to controversial privatization deals with his allies and relatives, Orbán has become Brussels' most troublesome partner. Today, we're joined by FTM journalist Jesse Pinster. Jesse has been following Hungarian politics and Orbán for years. And in his latest story, he uncovered how Orbán has handed over Hungary's entire defense industry to one of his closest business allies. Welcome, Jesse.
Good morning.
Jesse, can you share a little bit about where your own interest for this topic comes from?
Well, Hungary is probably the most fascinating country we have in the EU at the moment, and it has been for quite a long while. They define the playing field in Brussels because they take such extreme positions. I've been visiting Budapest over the years many times, been there as a radio reporter back in the days. So I was there, for instance, in 2018 during the elections. Remember long queues and with the opposition kind of an optimism, like, okay, this time we'll defeat Viktor Orbán. They got completely trashed that elections, even worse than the ones before. So, just by walking around there between all the George Soros posters that were hanging around because he's the evil guy, or it's von der Leyen is the evil guy. Just a couple of days ago, our colleague, Ada Homalova, sent us a picture from Budapest where she was. You had this huge posters with von der Leyen, who's apparently in the eyes of the Orbán government, some kind of puppet master, she's the face of evil.
And when you were reporting there, Orbán was about to be re-elected for his fourth term, and now we're already in his fifth term. And Alex, you're, of course, also very close to Budapest, living in Vienna. And from your observation, how has Orbán's leadership style sort of changed over the years?
I think, it's really interesting to remember he started out as the like a leading opposition figure, leading face of the opposition in the dying days of communism. And then he became, he was this long-haired, oppositionist who became a young reformer when democracy started in Hungary. And he was this liberal conservative politician. Initially, his party wouldn't admit anyone over 35. And then successively, he became prime minister in the late 90s for the first time, and he moved to the right. And now, by the point he became prime minister again in 2010, he had transformed himself from this, liberal reformist to somebody who's very much on the right, a conservative, a Christian, and more recently, he's taken positions that are more closely associated with the far right.
And so if you're talking about moving to the right, what kind of things should I be thinking about?
Orbán has taken a decidedly illiberal stance. So he's even talking about his ideal of an illiberal democracy, one that isn't as permissive, that isn't as pluralist, but is a bit more rigid, markets being tightly controlled by the state, or as in the case of Orbán's Hungary, where, kind of friends of the Hungarian government take a key role in some of the key economic sectors. And at the same time, freedom of speech, freedom of expression is tightly limited by the government, for instance, by saying that, pro-LGBT protests can't take place in certain public spaces and so forth. So I think that concept of illiberal democracy is key to understanding Orbán's Hungary.
And maybe just a short note on the 90s. You have to remember that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was this idea like we would advance, we would get rich like the Western countries of Europe. And that became a bit of a disappointment in the late 90s, early 2000s, when stuff happened. Like you got all the European banks going into Hungary selling mortgages, which they connected to, for some reason, to the Swiss currency, and the interest rates exploded at some point. So people have a really bad feeling with the whole liberalization and what it was supposed to bring, but didn't bring them themselves. And Orbán, being the chameleon that adjusts to what people want to hear, turned into this conservative when he found out after his first term as prime minister. He was out of office again, like, okay, I have to tell a different story, like, which connects to the disillusionment, sometimes the more conservative values in most of Hungary.
And it turned out that was also the story that the Hungarian people actually wanted to hear then, right?
And it helps if you redraw the borders of electoral districts. You do everything. You do very heavy media campaigns. You own a lot of the media. So it's not just the conservative people in Hungary voting for Orbán. It's a lot of tricks and maybe even illegal tricks that helped him to the position of power where he's right now.
How did Orbán's change in doing politics play out in Brussels, and how did other European leaders react to it, Jesse?
I mean, if you to give you just a recent example, if like all these sanctions packages we saw against Russia, because that's another interesting thing about Orbán. He's the most pro-Russian leader we have in the EU. It was really hard to agree on sanction packages. The Hungarians would sometimes find some oligarch that they did business with. I mean, this could be like a Russian company is still involved in building nuclear facilities for nuclear energy in Hungary. So you see a lot of pushback there. There's been a lot of efforts of trying to find money to fund Ukraine, help them funding the war, but also their budget, etc., etc. And it's always Orbán who is in front of the opposition, which makes it really hard and slow going for the EU to take any big decisions.
Something else that Brussels has been very concerned about when it comes to Orbán is his large-scale privatization and the fact that he has funneled state assets and EU funding to relatives and allies. And what's his game there?
Yeah, I find this fascinating to look at because it's been going on for the last 15 years. So I even worry if privatization isn't the right word. I mean, this is basically a kleptocracy where money from the state is funneled to the friends or the cronies of Viktor Orbán. Just to kind of illustrate that, I can give you two examples. Let's take one that happened really early on, so already in 2010. They thought of this tax scheme for football clubs. So private businesses in Hungary could get a big tax deduction if they gave a lot of money to football clubs, especially football clubs that were close to a big football fan, Viktor Orbán. So what happened was like a lot of tax money that would normally go to the state. I mean, you can fund hospitals or education or whatever, was basically going into these companies that were putting some money into football clubs. So already in 2010, this was a discussion. I mean, can you do this? Is it not illegal state aid? So they put that to Brussels. And because I also asked the European Commission for the communication, and there was none. So basically, they didn't ask any questions. I mean, it sounded like, okay, we're going to be on top of this from a Brussels perspective. But they hardly did. And you see over the years that you got more brazen with that. And I think the key example would be the so-called public interest funds or trusts, kind of foundations. They were set up and they got to run like public universities, for instance. So they transferred the public universities to these foundations, who happen to be run in most cases by sometimes even the chief of cabinet of Viktor Orbán. So you have the same politicians running those funds, but there's no state control anymore. And I mean, to make it even more attractive, for instance, they gave to a specific fund. They gave them a lot of shares in basically two of the biggest companies in Hungary. So you have MOL, which is an energy, gas and oil company, and you have Gideon Richter, which is pharmaceuticals. So the state owned shares in those companies from back in the days. So they gave them to those foundations as well. I mean, that's basically a transfer of not even tens, but hundreds of millions to these private interests. And I mean, this is one of the reasons that Brussels decided at some point, okay, these universities, they are not going to get like Erasmus funding anymore, which is currently still the case, because they say like, okay, this is just not in line with what we in Brussels see what should happen.
You just mentioned that the EU cut Erasmus funding to Hungarian universities, or to certain Hungarian universities. Mm-hmm. And aside from that, how has Brussels responded to these kind of things happening in an EU member state?
For a long time, they didn't, which is probably connected also with the place Orbán took back then, being part of the big Christian Democratic family at the time. But at some point, it started to shift, like when it was really clear how the media and at this stage also universities were being impacted. You finally had a real discussion in Brussels and the policymakers. I mean, NGOs and all were warning for this like for years already. And something changed. And that's basically when we got the rule of law mechanism. I clearly remember when that was part of the negotiations, because this was a crazy summit during Corona when they were discussing this huge recovery fund. And part of that whole negotiation was also that most countries wanted to have some more leeway to address issues with freedom of speech, freedom of the media, basically the whole rule of law. I mean, also judges, etc., that were impacted. So they wanted to have more tools, basically, to do something about that.
And what happened is that the EU member states went ahead and said, we're going to link a member state's rule of law to its ability to receive EU funding. And then from that point on, this rule of law conditionality mechanism was put in place, which would make it easy to say this one member state gets excluded from at least from some EU funding when it doesn't adhere to principles of the rule of law or is found to have consistently failed those principles. And that's what happened to Hungary.
And there's even discussions going on right now to take that even further, right? And to freeze more of EU money going to Hungary.
Yeah, but it's also moving the other direction, because von der Leyen, being the opportunist she is, unfreezed about 10 billion of those monies when she needed a vote from Viktor Orbán. And the Hungarians, you have to remember, I mean, the Fidesz government is run by lawyers, and they're really smart lawyers. I mean, nobody is as prepared in negotiations in Brussels as the Hungarian delegations. So what they recently did, for instance, was like, okay, so the European Commission said like, okay, you can shift around some of the funds, that are basically for, I don't know, build a highway, but you can use it for defense, because that's a lot more important at this stage. So the Hungarians thought, aha, this is going to work. So you freeze money because we use it for this or that. And that's like universities and stuff where it's problematic with freedom of the university, etc., etc. But if we shift it to defense, then we can get that frozen money, right? So they got another few 100 million out of that.
Thinking about money and the way Orbán uses money and uses EU funds, I don't think this issue of helping his relatives and allies, for example, through football clubs, that's not the only thing, right? There's been a wider controversy of how Hungary uses EU money. And where else does this issue show up?
Well, the classic one is agriculture, where you see it a lot. Like, I think even the father of Viktor Orbán owns quite a lot of land where you get per square meter you get your EU funds. But I'm not a specialist on that. But I did look into the defense side of things recently. What happened is that in Budapest, they noticed, okay, like defense spending is going to go up. Like at the NATO summit, like, okay, a promise of 5% of GDP. You see that the discussion in Brussels over the last few years, especially, of course, after the invasion of Ukraine and the war there, that, okay, defense is going to be a priority. The national governments are going to spend a lot more. That's by far the most. And then you have some EU funds, which, of course, they noticed early on in Budapest as well. It's interesting for it being a government that's really, pro-Russian in a way. And just, I mean, if you look at all the things that Viktor Orbán said about the war in Ukraine, then sounds a lot like the things that Donald Trump says, like, okay, we need peace and we're against war and we don't, Brussels is making more war and we don't want that. So you would say, okay, if that's really your point of view, then you're probably not going to agree to a lot of spending on defense, right? And they do. They see, okay, there's a lot of money coming. We want that. So how are we going to get that? That's more or less how I think the thinking went in Budapest over the last couple of years.
Orbán is against war, but maybe a little bit less against war when it means he can also receive more money.
Yeah, and so how do you go about it? And that's what I noticed like a few months back, was that a company that has been pretty close to Viktor Orbán, all of a sudden there was this announcement that they would get the shares of the government. The government has shares in defense companies, about nine of them, so they don't fully own them. In most cases, they own part of it. And all those assets would have been transferred to this company. So it actually started when I saw a picture. It was this picture of Viktor Orbán visiting Donald Trump. This was early December last year, so Donald Trump wasn't president yet. So Viktor Orbán went to Mar-a-Lago, the places where Trump normally lives. So you had this picture of him sitting there with Elon Musk, and you had the Hungarian foreign minister. So you had this three men, and then you had a bald head of a large man that turned out to be Gellert Yazai. And he's the owner, CEO of the company that would a few months later get all those shares in the defense companies.
So, and that's what prompted you to write your latest story on Orbán, that you work for Follow the Money. So what exactly did you discover about this company?
Well, for IG, and I have to tip of the hat to my colleagues in Hungary of Direct 36, who wrote a great profile back in 2023, because, well, let's take the person of Gellert Yazai. He was a real estate property developer around Lake Balaton. This was back in 2010, around there. So, well, when Viktor Orbán came to power. But then a few years later, he hooked up with Lorenz Mészáros, if I pronounce that right, because, I mean, I don't speak Hungarian at all. This guy is a very good friend from his youth of Viktor Orbán. He became the richest man in Hungary, to just underline my point about kleptocracy. Well, so you have this Gellert Yazai guy going into business with Mészáros. They took over a pretty small IT company, which in a few years' time grew into one of the biggest telecom players in Hungary, but also in the countries around Hungary. So this company was like growing at a really fast pace at the time. Clearly helped by Viktor Orbán, as the colleagues in Hungary showed. He really intervened in takeovers they did. And that's the interesting thing about this company, is just like acquiring companies left and right. And now we got the defense companies. They don't grow because they get better at making one specific thing. They just get bigger because they just eat up all this competition, which banks close to Orbán are willing to lend their money for. So that's that's the model. And yeah, we now at the stage that this company is not going to be a telecom company, but wants to go into space with Elon Musk. So I think that's it's worth our attention in that way.
And why exactly did you see this as so problematic? What made you feel like this was something worth writing about?
Because it fits so well with the patterns I saw before of getting the public ownership and shifting it to the private interests. Probably they do it even like with the foot on the gas pedal because elections are coming up in Hungary. So it makes sense that, I mean, if it happened that Fidesz and Orbán lose power and they're not, after 15 years, not the ones controlling everything anymore, it makes sense to have like your interests defended by all these other companies. So you still keep in power in some way because you still own the media, you still own the universities, and now you might also own defense companies. So that's one way to look at it. I must say that especially the opposition in Hungary sees it through a bit of a different lens, because what's also you're putting it in private hands, but these are more often than not also joint ventures with big European defense companies like Airbus or Rheinmetall. Rheinmetall is a very interesting one because they actually own 25% of 4IG, the company. So Rheinmetall, they own 25%. So you have all these foreign interests. So the more nationalist opposition in Hungary would say like, yeah, we're giving all our defense industry away to these interests outside of Hungary. So, I mean, there's different perspectives and different things going on that might make this kind of problematic.
When you're speaking about the opposition, I believe you even have a quote in your article where an opposition leader says that this whole deal is actually equal to treason, right?
Yeah. And this opposition guy is very smart in using social media and getting attention. I gave him the attention with this article as well. This is Peter Magyar. This is an interesting person because he's the main challenger at the moment of Viktor Orbán, and he's really opposed to this deal and making a point out that
it's not just you that thinks this deal is controversial, nor just the Hungarian opposition. It might actually also be against EU rules. And why is that?
I mean, that's probably kind of the same thing as with the football clubs. The most likely problem will be in the state aid department. So that basically those shares, they're maybe worth X, but they're sold for 20% less, then it would be most likely be illegal state aid. I spoke to a lot of experts who say like, okay, yeah, this looks dodgy. It might be against the rules, but at this stage, it's really hard for experts, but also for the European Commission, who has to look at that to really make a good assessment. Is something going wrong or not?
Something going wrong? What would that entail? When does it go wrong?
One of the main tasks of the European Commission is protecting the single market, like that we have an equal market where you don't have like a company in country A getting a lot of money from the government and a company B which does basically the same in another country not getting that and basically gets wiped out because of this. So that's kind of the logic behind it.
I mean, there's many different ways in which governments can kind of bend the EU market rules to favor certain companies. And one of them is state aid, illegal state aid, giving more subsidies to one company than the other. The other is favoring companies in public tenders. And there's also kind of legal changes that governments can make to favor certain companies over others. And I think the Hungarian government has been accused of using several of these tactics. And that obviously is a problem for Brussels, not just because of, the particular money, the public money being lost, but also because that, kind of creates an unfair competitive advantage for the companies involved.
And that's, I mean, to come back to what I said earlier, they're smart. They know what they're doing. So they're good at hiding that. So it will take the European Commission quite a long time to make a real assessment. That's kind of the difficult position Brussels will always find itself in. They can only react and not preempt stuff like that. So they're always like a couple of steps behind. And until they kind of catch up, like especially someone as smart as Orbán has already moved on. And maybe they even don't want to do that at this stage because it's defense, and defense is top priority number one. So any money going in there, getting more production in Hungary, which can help Ukraine, which can help like protect us against Russia, is welcome. So I don't know if the European Commission, from a political point of view, is even willing to touch this topic.
Maybe politically they're not going to want to do something about it. But what are the options to act? Like, what measures could they take against the Hungarian government to sort of punish them for doing this deal with 4IG?
Send angry letters. That's what they do. Send angry letters. Explain yourself some more. No, but in the end, you could be okay. You have to pay back the funding you gave to this company because it's not within the rules.
In many ways, this specific case follows a pattern that we've seen from Orbán many times before. But given the fact that this is a story about the defense sector, does that make it stand out for you? Or is it just another case in a sequence we have seen for a long time?
I think we should pay attention to what's happening in the defense industry right now. Just the fact that there's so much money going in there. So I mean, there's always opportunistic businessmen who will try to gain from that. And I mean, it's really, really a key subject at this moment. And there's not a lot of transparency. And I mean, there's good reasons for that. Of course, it's about national security. But that also creates a problem that there is a lot of shadow area where things can happen that you can definitely raise concerns about.
And not just in Hungary, I assume. I guess this is a wider problem. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, you already mentioned next year, elections in Hungary. I think that makes it extra salient that this is all happening with elections on the horizon. What role do these elections play in this whole picture?
Yeah, you cannot see it not being connected to the elections. They kind of speed up this privatization or this kleptocracy to get as much for their own before maybe there's a change of power. So that's something to be aware of, because in the polls, Peter Magyar, on which we touched briefly, is way ahead of Viktor Orbán at the moment. So he's likely to win those elections. Then again, I've been here before, like really the opposition being like, okay, this time it's going to be different, like they thought in 2018, and what they are thinking right now. I would say wait and see, because this is Viktor Orbán you're dealing with, and not some kind of regular election.
And as you mentioned, even if the opposition leader does win, we still have the situation where all these companies are already in the hands of Orbán's allies.
Yeah, you might divide it into two parts. You know, you have the actual rules that put in, and those you can change to a certain extent if you win a majority. The problem being you need a really large majority to change the constitution. And what Orbán and his friends have been doing for years, his political friends, is putting all those changes in the constitution, which you need like a 2/3 majority to change, which is unlikely to happen. So even things that shouldn't be in a constitution at all are put into a constitution. They should be regular laws, but they're not in Hungary. So that's already hard to change, and it's even harder to change the privatization part, where the private companies own the defense companies that used to be state companies, the public universities, etc., etc. That's even harder to turn back the clock on.
Yeah, I think the lesson we should take away from Orbán is that state capture and the degradation of the rule of law is very hard to undo once it's done. The damage, could take years, maybe even decades, to bring back, the stronger protection of the rule of law in Hungary. I think that's one of the worrying things about it.
With that, we'll leave it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Jesse. And you can find This story written by Jesse on this topic, but also his earlier stories on ftm.eu and in the show notes. And Alex and I will be back soon for another episode. Thank you, Jesse.
It was a pleasure.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.